In his final days, Smokey Yunick, the man who bent every rule in racing, was facing the one challenge he couldn't out-engineer: time. The noise that once filled his Daytona Beach garage had fallen silent. The laughter, the grinding metal, the sound of ideas turning into machines, all of it had faded into memory. Smokey Yunick wasn't just a mechanic. He was a rule breaker, a visionary, and an outlaw genius who believed that limits were meant to be tested. For decades, he built cars that defied logic, engines that humiliated giants, and innovations so far ahead of their time that even today, engineers still argue about how he did it. To Smokey, racing wasn't just about speed. It was about proving that ingenuity could outthink money. But as his body began to fail him, his mind refused to slow down. Friends said that even in his weakest moments, his thoughts still raced faster than any car he ever built. He knew his time was running short, yet there was something he needed to say, something that had been weighing on him for years. He spoke softly to those closest to him, hinting that he still had one last secret, a revelation he never dared share publicly. One that he claimed could change everything people thought they knew about racing, engineering, and the machines that defined his life. In the quiet of his final days, Smokey Yunick began reaching out. Old friends, rivals, protégés. Some came to pay respects. Others came seeking answers. And one visitor, in particular, would leave that day carrying a truth Smokey insisted the world wasn't ready to hear. He didn't fear death. He feared the world forgetting what he stood for. And before his story ended, he made sure that someone would remember, not just the man, but the message he left behind. What Smokey revealed before he passed would shock everyone who thought they knew him. And that secret would live far beyond the sound of his final engine. Before Smokey Yunick was a legend, he was just a farm kid from Neshaminy, Pennsylvania, with a wild imagination and an obsession with how things worked. When World War II broke out, he became a bomber pilot, a man who trusted his instincts more than the manual. Up there in the clouds, he learned something vital. Machines don't care about rules, only results. That lesson would follow him long after the war ended. When Smokey returned home, he brought with him a pilot's precision and a rebel's heart. He settled in Daytona Beach, Florida, and opened a small shop that would soon become the most famous garage in motorsports. To the racing world, it was a temple of innovation and controversy. He built engines that made NASCAR nervous, cars that danced on the edge of legality, and drivers who became champions because they trusted his genius. Smokey never asked for permission. He just did what worked. When officials protested, he smiled and pointed to the rulebook, saying, "It doesn't say I can't do it." Every victory made him a hero. Every accusation made him a legend. But behind the brilliance was a man who carried his own weight of defiance. He didn't chase money, and he didn't crave fame. What he wanted, what he demanded, was respect for the craft of thinking different. Yet, even as he changed the sport, he knew the system he fought would never truly accept him. He had built an empire of ideas too big to contain, and a reputation too stubborn to control. Smokey Yunick was the best damn mechanic the world ever saw, and the most dangerous man NASCAR ever tried to silence. And that same fire, that relentless refusal to conform, would burn inside him until the very end. By the late 1990s, Smokey's body had begun to betray the brilliance of his mind. The diagnosis came quietly: leukemia. A word that meant nothing to him at first, until it started stealing the strength from his hands. For a man who built his life around motion, stillness became his greatest enemy. He hated hospitals. He called them waiting rooms for the end. Instead, he turned his garage into his refuge. Machines surrounded him, notebooks covered in grease and graphite filled his desk, and even when his health began to fade, the fire inside him refused to dim. He worked in silence now. No crowds, no cameras. just the sound of his thoughts racing against the ticking clock. To the few who still visited, he seemed calm, almost content. But beneath that calmness was a storm. Smokey had spent his life chasing truths that the world wasn't ready to hear. And now, with time running out, he felt an urgency to pass them on. He began writing, dictating, scribbling every memory, theory, and design he could. Pages filled with equations, sketches, and sentences that felt more like warnings than instructions. "If I can't turn a wrench," he once said, "I'll turn a thought." Friends remember a man who seemed haunted, not by regret, but by unfinished work. They say he started reaching out to people he hadn't spoken to in years. Old rivals, former engineers, even the corporate men he once defied. No one knew why. Some thought he was saying goodbye. Others believed he was setting something in motion, something far bigger than anyone realized. And as the days grew shorter, Smokey Yunick's mind only accelerated, as if racing the disease itself to one last finish line. Word spread quietly through the racing community that Smokey's time was running out. And one by one, the people whose lives he had touched began to make their way back to that little garage in Daytona. They came not for fame or closure, but because Smokey Yunick was the kind of man you didn't forget, and the kind of man you couldn't ignore. Former drivers walked through those doors, remembering the times his wild ideas had scared them half to death, but somehow led to victory. Herb Thomas came, older now, eyes wet with gratitude, remembering the days they pushed machines beyond what anyone thought was possible. Junior Johnson showed up, his handshake longer than usual, a silent nod from one rebel to another. Even engineers from deep inside General Motors made their visits, men who owed their careers to the ideas Smokey had whispered to them decades earlier. But these weren't just goodbyes. Each conversation carried weight. Smokey wasn't reminiscing, he was instructing. He talked about the future of engines, about hidden efficiencies, about how modern racing was losing its soul. And to those who listened closely, he left pieces of something bigger, a message, a mission, maybe even a warning. As the visits went on, a strange pattern began to emerge. Smokey was deliberate about who he spoke to, careful about what he said. Every meeting ended with a quiet phrase or a scribbled note. And when the final visitor came, long after the sun had set, something changed. Smokey's tone grew serious. What he shared that night was unlike anything before. Because when that person walked out of the best damn garage in town, they weren't just carrying memories. They were carrying a secret Smokey Yunick swore could change racing forever. In those final months, Smokey Yunick became something more than a mechanic. He became a teacher. Not in classrooms or seminars, but through late-night phone calls, handwritten notebooks, and grease-stained pages he mailed to the next generation of dreamers. He called them my boys, though many were grown men. They were young mechanics, builders, and engineers who'd grown up idolizing him. He spoke to them about the lost art of thinking, about how modern engineers had traded creativity for convenience. He said the world was filling up with people who could follow directions but forgot how to ask why. His lessons weren't just about horsepower. They were about philosophy. One student recalled, "He didn't tell me how to build a car. He told me why it should exist." Smokey's notes weren't organized. They looked like the ramblings of a man racing against time. Numbers, arrows underlined words like heat efficiency and fuel vaporization. But within the chaos was genius. He talked about a combustion theory no corporation ever understood. An engine designed so efficient it could have changed everything. He warned them, they'll never let this kind of thinking see daylight. But keep it alive. Keep it pure. To outsiders, it was just Smokey being Smokey, still fighting invisible rules until his last breath. But those who knew him best began to sense something deeper. The way he spoke, the way he guarded certain details, was as if he was passing down a code. A code that, if decoded, could unlock something far greater than anyone realized. In the quiet hours of a hospital room, with machines humming softly and a Florida storm rolling outside, Smokey Yunick spoke his final truth. His daughter Trish sat by his side, the one person who had never left, never doubted, never tried to change him. He looked at her and said, "They'll never let the truth out, kid. But make sure someone does." His voice was weak, but his words were steady. He talked about the deals he'd turned down, the secrets buried under corporate contracts, and the things he'd built that the big boys upstairs didn't want the world to see. He wasn't afraid of death, but he was terrified of his work being erased, his legacy rewritten by the same people who once tried to silence him. Before he drifted into sleep, he handed her a sealed envelope. On the front, in his unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Open only when it's time." For years, she kept it locked away, unsure what time meant. Friends said she never spoke much about it. Others whispered that the envelope held blueprints for something the automotive world still isn't ready to face. But what mattered most was the message behind it. Smokey's last confession wasn't about money, fame, or revenge. It was about truth. He wanted his story told, unedited and unfiltered, even if it shook the very foundations of the racing world he helped build. And that sealed envelope would wait for nearly 2 decades before its contents saw the light of day. The night Smokey Yunick left this world wasn't filled with sorrow. It was filled with engines, laughter, and the people who loved him. His closest friends gathered in the shop that had been his church, his laboratory, and his battlefield. They told stories, drank beer, and tried to pretend it was just another night at the best damn garage in town. Smokey, frail but sharp, cracked jokes between labored breaths. Someone asked if he wanted to hear one last engine run. He grinned and said, "Hell yes." A mechanic rolled a small block Chevy to the open door, fired it up, and let it roar. The sound filled the room, bouncing off the metal walls. For a moment, everyone stopped talking. Smokey listened with a faint smile, the kind that comes from knowing your life's work will outlive you. For a man who spent his life chasing combustion, that sound was his prayer. He closed his eyes, hands resting on a yellowed notepad filled with sketches and half-finished thoughts. As the engine idled down, he whispered something no one caught. A single line, lost in the noise. Moments later, the engine shut off. The garage fell silent. When morning came, the world had lost one of its greatest minds and gained one final mystery. Because as the sun rose over Daytona Beach, no one yet knew that somewhere, in that very same garage, Smokey Yunick's final secret was still waiting to be discovered. Years passed. The garage grew quiet. The world kept racing forward, new engines, new champions, new technologies, but Smokey Yunick's name remained like a whisper in the background. To most, he was a memory. To a few, he was unfinished business. Then, one afternoon, nearly 20 years later, Trish Yunick opened the drawer where she had kept her father's envelope. She said the moment felt right, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was Smokey's voice in her heart. The paper had yellowed, the ink faintly smudged, but his handwriting was still unmistakable. Inside were pages, handwritten notes, sketches, calculations, and a letter that began with 7 simple words. To whoever's still got fire in their gut. The notes described an engine design unlike anything the industry had ever pursued. Smokey called it the hot vapor engine, a hybrid of gasoline and diesel principles that achieved almost impossible efficiency. He claimed it could run with minimal emissions, near total fuel burn, and power that would shame the giants of Detroit. According to the letter, he had already built one. "They'll call it fantasy," he wrote, "until they hear it run." Trish described the letter as a mix of genius and frustration. It wasn't a farewell, it was a challenge. Smokey seemed to be daring the next generation to pick up where he left off, to prove that innovation didn't belong to corporations, but to people with courage. He ended the letter with a line that felt more like a prophecy than advice. When the world starts caring more about ideas than image, that's when it'll be time. For Trish, opening that envelope didn't just uncover her father's final design. It reopened the mystery he'd left behind. After the letter surfaced, old rumors came roaring back to life. People started asking questions. Did Smokey actually build that engine? If so, where was it now? Some claimed it was buried somewhere in his old workshop, hidden behind walls or beneath the floorboards. Others whispered that before his death, Smokey had moved his most valuable projects into a private storage unit in Daytona, rented under another name. A retired mechanic swore he saw it once. A strange engine block with markings unlike anything he'd ever seen. It shouldn't have existed, he said, but it did. Another former associate hinted that representatives from General Motors visited Smokey weeks before he passed. The story went that they made an offer to acquire his unfinished work, and possibly his silence. But the truth has never been confirmed. The hot vapor engine was real. Smokey had proven its concept years earlier. Yet this version, his final iteration, seemed to vanish without a trace. Some believe it was dismantled. Others insist it was bought, buried, and forgotten, hidden in the name of corporate control. No one knows where it went, but everyone who's looked for it says the same thing. That engine wasn't just mechanical, it was spiritual. It represented freedom, rebellion, and defiance. And maybe that's why it disappeared. Because what Smokey Yunick built in his last years wasn't just a piece of machinery. It was a message, a symbol of what happens when one man refuses to let the system win. In a quiet interview years later, Trish Yunick said something that stopped everyone listening cold. "The engine still exists," she said softly, "and one day the world will know where." She wouldn't elaborate. She didn't need to. That single statement reignited the myth of Smokey Yunick and turned his final creation into legend. But maybe that was the point all along. Smokey had spent his life proving that boundaries only exist to be challenged. Whether the engine is hidden in a barn, a warehouse, or locked deep inside a corporate vault, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that it exists. Smokey's true legacy isn't made of metal and gasoline. It's made of defiance, curiosity, and courage. He taught generations that innovation doesn't come from permission. It comes from persistence. In his final days, he didn't fear death. He feared a world that would stop asking questions. And so he left behind one last riddle. A blueprint for the future disguised as a piece of the past. Smokey Yunick's story ends the same way his engines began, with a spark. Because somewhere in Florida, under a thin layer of dust, something he built still waits, silent, untouched, ready to start again.